Welcome to this Fathom interview. I'm Giacomo Giacomin, Deputy Editor of Fathom. Alongside me is fellow Deputy Editor Khaled Ben-Dor. We're delighted to be joined today by Fania Oz-Salzberger. Fania is an Israeli writer, history professor, and public intellectual. She's Professor Emerita at the University of Haifa Law School and previously taught at Princeton, Monash University, Munich, and Munich University, along with others. Her field is the history of political thought, and her books include Jews and Words, co-authored with her father, Amos Oz. She is a peace and democracy activist. Fania, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
We're going to conduct a wide-ranging conversation, but I'd like to start with something which has occupied many of us, particularly those of us who think of ourselves as on the left, over the last 6 months, which is the response of the international left primarily to the events of October 7th, but also to what has followed, and the glaring lack of solidarity from the majority of that international left. What have been your impressions of that? Have we learned something new about this particular type of left-wing thought? Has it just been an extreme version of trends that were already ongoing there? What's your take?
Well, this is a good question. And of course, we will need later to discuss what's going on in the Hamas-Israel war itself. But your point about parts of the international left were clear since day one, since the 7th, the 8th of October, long before the war erupted, long before Israel even entered Gaza. And of course, there is more than one kind of left in the world. And I have to say that among my best, most staunch and loyal friends in this catastrophe are people from the old left, people whose left has been social democratic, people who are humanists, people who are liberals, left liberal, who take human life to be equal, whether it's Jewish or Palestinian or anyone else. The kind of left that we are talking about here, which is all over the digital media, because a lot of young people adhere to it without knowing a lot about history, about facts, about context, is the left that emerged from the branch of postmodernism, which we can dab post-colonialism, an extremist post-colonialism. A branch of the left that does not just say that imperialism or colonialism is bad or immoral or unjust. It also says that the Jewish inhabitants of Israel, the Jewish citizens of Israel, the state of Israel itself, despite the fact that it was legally vetted by the United Nations and the international community back in 1947, is a post-colonialist state. Hence, our blood can be spilled by the insurrection, by the resistance, by Hamas, by the murderers and the rapists. We had it coming, we deserve it because we are settlers on a stolen land. These people, if they're listening to us now, might want to skip this conversation altogether because it's not them that I'm speaking to. But I would be happy to address them, of course, if they want me to answer their questions. So to the post-colonialist extreme left, I say Israel is not post-colonial. Zionism has not been colonialism in any Western sense or in any academic sense. Israel has a right to exist within its internationally recognized borders. The liberal left, the old social democratic left, acknowledges generally Israel's right to exist. The post-colonialist left, the ignorant left, does not.
Thank you, Fania. Firstly, it's such a privilege to speak to you, so thank you. We'll now kind of begin to focus on the war. I'm interested, before we get to maybe how your thoughts have evolved over time. I don't know if they have or not, but kind of on the 7th, the 8th, the 10th, mid-October, to what extent did you broadly agree with the kind of government's goals for the war, namely kind of destroying Hamas or demilitarizing Hamas, trying to free the hostages, etc. You know, as a kind of Zionist, humanist, liberal, left-wing Israeli, to what extent did you support those aims?
Well, first of all, I have to say something very, very clear. On the 7th, on the 8th, on the 10th, in mid-October, for many weeks later, there was no educated conversation, armchair debate taking place between citizens and government in Israel or among the citizens themselves. And I'm afraid not even in the government. Everyone was shell-shocked. Everybody I know was tragically hit. Dozens of people I personally know and love were bereaved, suddenly and brutally bereaved. We were all in a state of dire shock. Some of us still are. I think we have to kick out of that state. It's time to kick out of that state. But we were hurt so badly, so suddenly, so brutally, and so viciously that there was no real public opinion debate going on. The Israeli public opinion at the time was one big scream. So the question was not whether or not I agree with the government on the 8th of October. I was furious with the government before the 7th of October. And I was doubly or tenfold furious with the government almost immediately after. I was furious before because we were having a coup d'etat against Israeli democracy since January 23. Before the 7th of October, with a series of anti-Supreme Court legislations, with laws intended to break up the Israeli separation of powers and eventually to injure civil rights and civil equality against the Palestinians, against the Israeli Arabs. We were already up and running against our government during those months. That was the democracy protest. And then came the 7th of October, and not a word was heard from Mr. Netanyahu or any of the government ministers on the day of the catastrophe, and very few days afterwards. And the ministries did not function. It was civil society that rose to the challenge to help the injured, the evacuees, the families of the missing. So, you know, we were too busy to decide what is our opinion about the government or its policies on the 8th in the aftermath of the 7th of October. But I did know, vaguely, but I knew that there has to be a war against Hamas. Hamas has to be defeated, not eradicated, not erased. Hamas is an idea, a horrible idea, but you don't erase or eradicate ideas. Not kill each and every supporter of Hamas in Gaza or in the West Bank. You don't kill people merely for their opinions. But that Hamas, as an organization ruling Gaza, as the terrorist government of Gaza, must be defeated and ousted from power. I already knew early on that this would be an ugly war, not a genocide, not an onslaught against innocents, but a very ugly and dirty war, because every war fought in Gaza, in the urban labyrinths of Gaza, top Gaza and underworld Gaza, under the ground, would be an ugly and dirty war. I did not know to what extent. I did not know how many innocents or civilians, allegedly innocent, would be hurt, but I knew it would be an ugly war. And nevertheless, I repeat this every opportunity. Hamas must be defeated and ousted from ruling Gaza.
Thank you,
Not
Fania.
just for the Israelis' sake, by the way, but also for the Palestinians' sake and for the sake of any slimmest chance and hope of peace in our part of the Middle East.
Thank you. To drill down a little bit more into some of the issues you've explored there, return to a distinction you made in your first answer between the radical or post-colonial left and the social democratic left. In Europe, we are seeing increasing voices from amongst the social democratic left, who since October 7th have supported that wider war aim of the defeat of Hamas, but have qualms or criticisms with the manner in which the war has been prosecuted. How do we square the legitimacy of that war aim with the undoubted suffering that we're seeing taking place in Gaza?
Well, you know, Jack, I also have qualms and criticisms, a lot of them, about how this war is being run. I don't get to choose my army. I didn't get to choose this war. Hamas chose it. And the Israeli army is behaving, as I see it, differently than in previous rounds, in previous wars. There is more anger, there is more fear. Yes, soldiers can be fearful too. There is a sense of existential threat to the very existence of Israel. People are deeply crushed and also humiliated by the 1,200 victims of the 7th of October, by the murder, by the rape, normally followed by murder, by the abductions, the hostages, the treatment of the hostages. Yes, the army is not fighting nicely in Gaza. I know about a lot of attempts, a lot of moves taken by the military to warn, to pre-warn the civilian population. This is not a perfect set of methods to pre-warn, to ask people to move on, and so on. There have been dire cases of mishandling civil population. There have been mistakes. Every war has mistakes. There have been war crimes. Every war has war crimes. Only yesterday, we were informed that 7 aid workers from an international organizations were killed by an errant IDF missile. This is now being investigated. This is either a bad mistake or a war crime. It will have to be investigated and lessons drawn and sanctions taken if needed. Having said all that, no war is without dire mistakes and, unfortunately, war crimes. The United States wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had a higher toll, I'm told much higher toll, of civilian death per combatant death. So the Israeli army is trying and often failing, and I feel terrible about it. But this is the war imposed upon us by Hamas. I also feel, I have to add that, to be totally honest, that any other Israeli prime minister, from Begin and Shamir and Rabin and Peres, Barak and Olmert, and Bennett and Lapid, would have fought this war differently, would have conducted both the war and the international sphere differently. I think Netanyahu is doing it in the worst possible way, and not doing a great favor to the Israeli nation or to the future of the state of Israel and Palestine.
Fania, I want to ask you to try and square another circle. We've got lots of circles that need squaring. Firstly,
not all circles can be squared, Caleb. Some
probably most.
Unsquared.
Maybe no circles can be squared. But I actually want to clarify something, because you were saying that a different Israeli government would have fought the war differently, but they would have fought the war, and they would have almost certainly had a war aim of destroying or trying to significantly weaken Hamas, and it also probably would have been ugly. So it's quite interesting. I think sometimes and I'd love you to speak about the Netanyahu government in a moment, but in some ways it's too easy to say it's Netanyahu and the government. There are obviously things that they would have done that others wouldn't have, but there's also probably quite a large realm of common denominator between what this government is doing and what other governments would have done. Can you try and tease that out, do you think?
Yes, but for that I also have to introduce a third player to the scene, which is the international community. So I want to say very clearly that this is not only about Hamas and its terrorists. This is not only about Israel and its prime minister and government that happens to be the worst in our history. This is also about the international community. This is about the fact that the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, the head of the United Nations, could have landed in Tel Aviv first thing in the morning of the 8th of October and started hopping between Tel Aviv and Gaza and negotiating an agreement. He didn't. He stayed at home. He said that the murders of the 7th of October are context dependent. He angered most of the Israelis. The international community did not act quickly enough. It should have acted. It could have prevented catastrophe. It did not. Going back to the Prime Minister of Israel. Every Prime Minister we had before, whether he or she were right-wing or left, Likud or Labor, militant or peacenik. We also had peacenik prime ministers, not least Levi Eshkol and Yitzhak Rabin, would have concentrated on the good of the state of Israel on several fronts, militarily, civically, humanly, internationally, and would have taken rational decisions from his or her understanding, reading of the situation. Benjamin Netanyahu is not making rational decisions for the good of the state of Israel based on his best reading of the situation. Neither politically, nor militarily, nor humanly, towards Palestinian innocence, but also towards his own nation, the bereaved and the victims of his own nation, and certainly not internationally. Benjamin Netanyahu is bent on one goal and only one goal: to remain in power, to remain Israel's prime minister even after the horrible failure of his own policy and government on the 7th of October. And what he's doing now, including the dragging on of a hostage deal. Of course, Hamas is making huge claims, but Netanyahu has turned down reasonable options for a hostage deal because he needs to keep the extreme right partners in his coalition, Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the others. Because he does not want a hostage deal which will involve releasing terrorists from Israeli prisons. Because the extreme right will abandon him and we shall have elections, his worst nightmare. And he will lose those elections, most likely. And then his trial on 3 cases of corruption will go on quicker, and he might find himself in jail. This is the long and the short of it, I'm afraid. We have a prime minister indicted on charges of corruption and bringing self-interest, his own and his family's self-interest, into one of the worst and most dangerous moments of decision-making in Israeli history.
I'd like to ask you, Fania, about kind of, I guess, non-Hamas or non-militant Palestinians. I think this is something that you tweeted the other day about kind of being willing to kind of meet with a Palestinian partner, willing to understand your narrative and history and reach a historic compromise with you. In the aftermath of October 7th, how kind of optimistic or pessimistic are you of kind of the existence of a strong Palestinian constituency who is willing to kind of recognize the Jewish legitimacy and historic connection to the land and find some sort of historic compromise with the Jewish people?
Thank you for the question, Caleb. I don't work with optimism and pessimism. I work with hope. I'm not optimistic, but I have hope. Hope is a tool. I'm working with this tool. I've been working with it for years. There are Palestinians, even in Gaza, that are too busy now to discuss the Jewish position, and I don't blame them. Even in the West Bank, where they are suffering the Israeli occupation, but there are still moderate voices. And in the Palestinian diaspora, in the worldwide Palestinian diaspora world, I would have liked to hear more voices calling in this direction. Look, there are 2 ways of looking at it, actually 3 ways, if you take the most extreme. The first is the two-state solution, dividing the land along some agreed line, perhaps the green line of the truce of 1949, going on to 67, between an Israel and a Palestine, sovereign, independent, free, neighboring, perhaps not neighborly for a while, but neighboring in relative peace. This is my solution. This is, in my mind, the only solution. The second, that a lot of Palestinians are talking about, is one state to rule them all. And that would be an Arab state, a Palestinian state, the so-called one-state solution, allowing each and every Palestinian from the Palestinian diaspora into the land of Israel in the name of their great-parents or great-grandparents, because with Palestinians, and I think only with Palestinians, the refugee status stays on and on along 3 or 4 generations. So bring them all in, claiming their land and houses. What about the Jews? The Jews either succumb to that or move out. Palestinian majority, a Jewish minority, and Arab regime, no more Israel. This is the one-state solution. I will not have it. I think we are entitled to our independent land, a democracy for the Jews and all its citizens called Israel. And the third is, of course, eradicating each and every Jew in Israel, which is what Hamas is about, which is what Hezbollah is about, which is what extremists in the West are about, killing us off or sending us out to wherever. And this is a no-go too. So among these 3 solutions, the two-state, the one Palestinian state, and the no-Jew zone, I can only stick with the two-state solution, and I call upon every moderate Palestinian in the world to consider the two-state solution. Enough blood has been spilled, Jewish blood and Palestinian blood, and this is the only relatively bloodless solution we can look forward to.
Thank you, Fania. I'd like to return to the intellectual sphere just for a moment, and the sort of anti or post-colonial left, which you identified in your first answer. We know that it is now, an overwhelmingly anti-Zionist sort of popular movement, as well as an overwhelmingly anti-Zionist worldview. There is another strand of post-colonial thinking which takes a different view on Zionism, particularly that of the great Albert Memmi. I'm wondering really whether you see our battle as in kind of circumventing the post-colonial frame as a left movement, or whether we should be trying to forge a battle within post-colonial thinking that has a sort of Memmiite view of Zionism, if you see what I mean.
Well, maybe you should tell our listeners a little more about the Memmiite kind of view.
Well, recognizing that viewing Zionism as a settler colonial philosophy was wholly inappropriate, particularly as a Tunisian Jew himself. Memmi recognized the precarious state of Jews in that part of the Middle East to which they were indigenous, and therefore it was even more inappropriate prism through which to view Zionism. Recognizing Zionism in itself as perhaps an anti-colonial liberation movement of its own.
Yes.
I wonder if you think there's room for that.
Absolutely, and Memmi put it well by comparing the situation to Algeria under the French occupation.
Yeah.
And he was also a Jew, and he understood. Look, my 4 grandparents came from what is today the Ukraine and Lithuania. They came to the land of Israel. They were culturally Zionists. They felt they deeply belong historically and culturally to the land of Israel. But when they left Europe because they had no other choice. The Nazis were already in power. Anti-Semitic attacks were growing in their towns and villages. They applied for visas all over the world. They had nowhere to go. Nobody wanted them. Many, perhaps most, of the 600,000 Jews who lived here in 1948, and about a similar number of Palestinians, 600,000 Jews had nowhere to go. They were either born here, there were already people generation or two here, and some families far longer than that, or they came here because they were persecuted in Europe. The clock was ticking to a minute before Auschwitz, and they had nowhere else to go. This is not colonialism. There was no superpower behind them. There were no ships and trade and the navy and an army to defend and help them take over land. They came here as individuals and in small political movements. They bought the land from its owners. Only in the war of 48 was Arab land conquered by Jews. That was in a war started by the Palestinians and 5 Arab armies that invaded the land. Before that, what we had, we bought. My kibbutz bought its lands and settled upon it. Israel was recognized as legal in 1947 and again in 1949 within those borders, within the Green Line. So definitely I am a Zionist with a small z. I'm a Zionist within the Green Line, within the 48 borders, within the smaller Israel. I'm the child of Zionists, and I'm a Zionist calling myself a humanist Zionist. Equal rights to Arab citizens of my country, a peaceful, independent, next door Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, and acting legally within the confines of the very humanist Israeli Declaration of Independence of 1948. So just to tell the anti-Zionists, the haters, those who think that we have to be erased or should have never happened, there's no way Zionism is going away. It must be set back to the humanist, democratic, liberal Zionism of the Declaration of Independence of Israel. It must be taken off the hands of those right-wing extremists in Israel who abducted it for messianic purposes, for ultranationalist purposes. But Zionism, in the small, thin sense of a state for the Jews and all its citizens within the ancestral land, and possibly alongside Palestine, is here to stay. And this is what I stand for.
Thank you, Fania. That's a really poignant and important point to end with. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real privilege. I feel like it's your voice is such an important voice that too few of us hear. So thank you for sharing it.
And thanks for the opportunity. And I'd be delighted to see you both again. And if you ever pass by Zichron Yaakov, there is a nice view, good coffee, and friendly dogs to welcome you.
Thank you, Fania.
Most welcome. Good luck, guys.
Bye.
Take care. Later out.